So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope we are all okay this morning. Just to request you to, as you register, or request that you put your names, and just next to your name, put the sector you coming in from, whether it's NPO or it's casino or it's real estate, precious metals and stones. Just indicate the sector, your sector. You can have your name, maybe Ivan Bogeret dash, then the sector. So you should be able to edit. This is just for registration purposes, but we will be starting shortly. My colleague will be taking us through, will be joining us shortly. Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, we can hear you.
Morning.
Good morning, we can hear you. Hello?
Good morning, everyone. We're about 60 participants as so far that have joined. I request that we start the training. We've been waiting for people to log on. Thank you for taking time to join this training. Thank you for taking time to join this training. The agenda will flow as follows. We shall start with opening remarks from our manager, compliance and inspection on behalf of the executive director of FIA. Take your volume as well. Sorry about that, Mr. Ngobi. You can take the floor to give us opening remarks on behalf of the executive director of FIA and open this training officially. Mr. Ngovi? Wait for Mr. Ngovi to join in to give the opening remarks. Kindly to take you through the housekeeping rules. We request that you join in as the entity that you represent or where you're coming from in order for us to capture the attendance for ease of reference to know where each and every one of you is coming from. So kindly, please register or log in as to indicate to us the entity that you're representing so that we can capture the attendance very well to know which institutions you're coming from. Thank you. All right, a brief background of the training. Currently, we have been put on the gray list. What the gray list means is the list of high-risk jurisdictions, countries that the Financial Action Task Force has identified to have the strategic deficiencies, and Uganda is one of them. So we are fighting hard to get off that gray list. And when you have been put on the gray list, you have to make a high-level political commitment to address the identified strategic deficiencies. So we have strategic deficiencies that were identified by the Financial Action Task Force. And these are what we have to address because we made a political commitment, high-level political commitment, meaning it's made by the minister as a country that we commit to address the identified deficiencies. And some of the deficiencies included the deficiencies in the legal framework that has gaps to address the targeted financial sanctions for terrorism financing and proliferation financing. So to address this deficiency, we as a country, we embarked on the enactment of the Anti-Terrorism Act, the amendment of the Anti-Terrorism Act, that's 2022, to streamline the identified deficiencies. And also there was a deficiency of the legal framework, lack of a legal framework that provides for the implementation of the targeted financial sanctions. So we still embarked on the enactment of the Anti-Terrorism Amendment Regulations 2023. So this is a background of where we are coming from. We have these identified deficiencies in our AML, anti-money laundering, CFT, combating the financing of terrorism, and also combating proliferation financing in our system. So we have to address those identified deficiencies. So as giving you a brief background, as I think now the manager compliance, the connection has now come through. So he's ready to take on the floor with that brief background of where we are coming from to give the opening remarks. Thank you very much. Mr. Ngovi, you can take on the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Fiona. Can you now, all of you hear me?
Yes, sir, we hear you.
Am I clear? Yeah, so I just want to welcome all of you to this important training. And I bring apologies. I bring apologies from the Executive Director of the Financial Intelligence Authority and the top management who have not been able to make it due to some urgent commitments. I welcome today's training is mainly for DNF designated 9 financial businesses and professions. And for today, we have the real estate sector, the NGOs, and the casinos. We apologize that we were not able to organize the physical training due to some logistical challenges, but we are happy that you have been able to make it. Do you want to share this? Later. Yeah, we can share. So I want to thank the Fiona who has organized it, Fiona Nabagala, for this. I'm David Ngovi Ruigo, Manager Compliance and Inspection, and I welcome in this training, I welcome the Executive Director. I've seen him of the National Lotteries and Gaming Board, and among the other dignitaries who are on this training. I also welcome all other participants from the NGOs, the NGOs, the casino, and the others. I just want to share the screen so that we can know the background, because these are important matters which I feel that we should all be brought on board. So, this one. Share. This one. Yeah. I want to share these important things because I want to share them so that we are all brought on board and we are aware of the challenges our country is facing. So, as accountable persons, we are aware of our obligations under the Anti-Money Laundering Act and Combating Financing of Terrorism framework. The framework is premised on global standards established by the Financial Action Task Force. I will be using these terms interchangeably. AML, CFT, CPF. We have the three terms related to anti-money laundering, countering financing of terrorism, and countering proliferation financing. So the global standards prescribe a framework for prevention, detection, investigation, prosecution, penalization, confiscation, and international cooperation. So the Financial Task is an intergovernmental body established by the group of seven G7 countries in 1989, but it has since expanded and there are now 36 countries. Of course, for your information, it is only South Africa in Africa which is a member. So under the Financial Action Task Force, all member countries have an obligation to ensure that their financial systems and NFPs are protected against money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing, and other financial crimes. So the Financial Action Task Force operates through the financial style regional bodies. These regional bodies adopt and monitor implementation of the anti-money laundering and of the AML safety global standards. Uganda is a member of ESAMLAG. The ESAMLAG is the Eastern and Southern African anti-money laundering group, which now has presently 20 members, and the Uganda is one of the members. So Uganda joined in 1999. So the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, enforces compliance to global standards through the International Cooperation Review Group. The ICRG is composed of a team of experts mandated to analyze the high-risk jurisdictions and recommend specific actions to address money laundering, TF risks emanating from them. So the global framework has an established sanctions framework. So FATF may place a non-compliance jurisdiction under increased monitoring, also known as the gray list. This is where matters are getting bad for us because Uganda is on the gray list of the Financial Action Task Force. So jurisdictions may be subjected to a call for action, that is blacklist. And in blacklist, for your information, we only have Iran and North Korea. So Uganda is in what are called in the other jurisdictions under monitoring, the next list, and that's a gray list. And I will be shortly telling you what the gray list is all about. So jurisdiction may be subjected to a call for action if we blacklist, then that means no business with them for being non-cooperative in the global fight against money laundering and terrorist financing. So Uganda, as you are aware, underwent a second mutual evaluation in 2016 by our peer, the ISAMLAG. So Uganda scored low in all the 11 immediate outcomes, and those immediate outcomes, we shall be getting some details later about them. That means we were deemed low, and it was placed on a one-year observation period that ended in December 2019. The post-observation period report conducted in 2019 by the ICRG concluded, ICRG is the International Cooperation Group, that concluded that Uganda had not made tangible and positive progress towards increasing effectiveness of anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism. So in March 2020, following a decision by FATF plenary, Uganda was placed on the list of jurisdictions under increased monitoring. That is the gray list. So being placed, what does this mean? This is where we wanted you to know. Being placed on the FATF gray list implies that every FATF member country, and in fact all countries of the world, they are now about 200. Every FATF member country is required to exercise caution and take appropriate steps against financial institutions, against financial transactions originating from or destined to countries on this list. International financial institutions may apply enhanced due diligence measures, leading to unnecessary delays and increased cost of doing business. And so when you are placed on the gray list, it means that for businesses, there is extra precaution from other countries. So this has caused us to be, Uganda is among other countries, we are on that gray list. So when Uganda was placed on the gray list in February 2020, we have the National Anti-Money Laundering CFT Task Force accordingly developed a plan to address the strategic deficiencies identified in the FATF Action Plan. As at March 2023, 18 out of the 22 action plan items have been addressed. So just to update you that we have made a lot of progress, and 4 action items are outstanding, of which progress has been registered on them, which have been ranked as partly addressed. These outstanding action items will be discussed in the next reporting cycle of Financial Action Task Force plenary in June 2023. And so I want just briefly to tell you what some of the things we are supposed to carry out. So these were some of the things Uganda was supposed to do, and a lot of progress was made. One of them was to adopt a national strategy in combating AML safety, which was done and given. And so we seek international cooperation in the country's risk profile, develop and implement risk-based supervision of financial institutions and designated non-financial business and professionals. So you belong to that category. The three reporting entities you represent today, you belong to that category. And then others were to ensure competent authorities have timely access to accurate, basic and beneficial ownership information for legal entities. So you can see, under like this one, Uganda had to amend the Companies Act and many others, the Partnership Act, Cooperative Act, and the others to ensure that this is done. And also we have had to, of recent, they are asking for beneficial information because it's arising out of this action item. Others, I may not read them, but I want you to look at this. As for today, let us look at number 7, which is to address the technical deficiencies in the legal framework to implement proliferation financing related to targeted financial functions, and implement a risk-based approach for supervision of its non-profit sector. I know many NGOs are here to prevent terrorism financing abuse. So as So Uganda has continued to address the action plan agreed upon with the FATF. There is hope that the country will exit the grey list by the end of this October 2023. So amendments have been made to the laws which were identified to be deficient, and subsequently, His Excellency the President assented to them. These include the Anti-Money Laundering Act, the Anti-Terrorism Amendment Act, Companies Act, Partnership Act, Trustees Incorporation Act, and Insolvency Act, and the attendant regulations. So, as you note, high-level delegation being placed on the FATF grey list means like every 4 months, we have to make a presentation on what has been done. So high-level delegation to FATF, the ICRG has a face-to-face component. Meetings have been made in September 2022. That was in Livingstone, Zambia, January 2023 in Morocco, and May 2023 in Mauritius. And our delegations have included the Honorable Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs, Honorable Attorney General, Honorable Ministers of State for Finance, Planning and the General Duties, Minister of State for Internal Affairs. The country has got positive review due to these renewed efforts, which is reflected in the latest assessment. So, among the status of implementation, some of the outstanding FATF action items include to provide guidance that is on the issue of proliferation financing, which you are aware we amended the Anti-Terrorism Act to provide for the proliferation financing. We also amended the regulations, the Anti-Terrorism Regulations of 2016 to provide for targeted financial functions. So one of the outstanding items was to provide guidance to financial institutions designated DNFBPs, as you are now called, on proper implementation of the AML safety obligation in respect of money laundering, terrorism financing, risk assessment, customer due diligence, and targeted financial sanctions. So, as you are aware, we have made progress in this area. Bank of Uganda has come up with the regulations on targeted finance sanctions, and it has also carried out training. So Uganda is yet to carry out the training of the DNFBPs, but banks, financial institutions have been trained. Recently, we had also training of the law enforcement officers. So the progress is being made. And then to implement risk-based monitoring procedures for on-site and off-site inspections. And this is one of the reasons why we have invited the regulatory authorities, the supervisory bodies of the DNFBPs, because they are supposed to work out ways of ensuring that this is done. So, of course, the last one was take remedial action and apply dissuasive, proportional and dispensive sanctions for non-compliance. So, as you are aware, the Anti-Money Act has been amended to provide for administration of the sanctions regime, and the regulations of 2023 have been made. The Anti-Money Act was amended in September to provide for administrative sanctions. So as I conclude, I want to inform you that this is a very important training for the supervisory bodies and to the accountable persons to ensure compliance. We urge you to be conversant with the relevant laws, because the legal framework has has had drastic changes in the past few years, and this will impact on how you operate. So this training is basically to guide us, and so that we are going to indicate those who have attended, so that Uganda would be considered in the next plenary of FATF to be removed off the grey list. I thank you for coming, and I invite now Fiona to continue with the training. I urge you, all of us, to take it seriously and also disseminate the issue. The issue is that this information, whatever you learn, you are supposed to disseminate. The supervisory bodies will in the near future be carrying out their compliance inspections, and one of the issues that it attracts a penalty now is training of the personnel under you. So please, I urge all of you to disseminate and pass on this information to the subordinates and other officers in your organization. Thank you for listening, and I can now hand over to Fiona to invite the rest.
Thank you, Mr. Ngovi, for the opening remarks, for that background on where we are coming from as a country and where we are at right now in regards to the implementation of the FATF requirements, and also the International Cooperation Review Group Action Plan. My name is Fiona Nabagala. Allow me to start the video shortly so that you put the face to the name as to who you're speaking to right now. My name is Fiona Nabagala. I work with the Financial Intelligence Authority as the senior training and outreach officer. Today, we are having a training on implementation of targeted financial sanctions for the DNFBPs. And I'm sure many of you are asking yourselves, what is DNFBPs? And where we come across it, it refers to the designated non-financial businesses and professions. So this is where the NGOs lie, the real estate agents, the casinos, and for the professions, that's for the accountants and the lawyers who will be having their session tomorrow. So today's session is only for the real estate agents, NGOs, casinos, and the NPOs and their respective supervisory authorities. So to kickstart the training, at the end of this training, you will be in position to know what do we mean by the implemented. Kindly allow me, give me a minute to share the presentation. Evan? Can anyone confirm that the presentation?
Yes. Fiona, we can see the
slides are
presentation.
displaying
We can see the presentation.
in the chat. Before I proceed, all right, thank you for the quick response. So the training today will address the key terms and definitions so that you understand what do we mean by terrorism financing, what do we mean by proliferation financing, and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and what are the penalties that are attached to those crimes or offenses. And then we shall dive into the methods, terrorism financing methods, to give you a hint on what proliferation typologies include, for example, the use of NPOs, and also why is it important that we are advocating for this prevention of proliferation financing. At the session still, you will understand the legal framework regarding the combating of financing of terrorism and combating of proliferation financing. So where you see the short forms of CFT and CPF, CFT means combating the financing of terrorism, and CPF means combating proliferation financing. So without the C, it will be, FT will be financing of terrorism, and PF will be proliferation financing. So from that point, we shall dive into what are sanctions, and then you will understand what do we mean by targeted financial sanctions and what it encompasses to implement the targeted financial sanctions. Therein, you'll get a picture of the CPF supervision in Uganda. What do we mean by combating proliferation financing? What does it look like in Uganda to combat proliferation financing? And which ministries are involved in combating proliferation financing? Then we shall dive into the red flags and the indicators, as well as your legal obligations as the DNFVPs. Thereafter, we shall have the conclusion. And at that point, we shall welcome the questions. So to start with the definitions, proliferation financing is defined in the Anti-Terrorism Amendment Act, which defines the offense where a person makes available an asset or a financial service or conducts a financial transaction or facilitates any activities such as manufacture, production, or possession or transportation of the nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, or biological weapons. So in simple terms, any act that involves the manufacture, production, the definition is extensive. It goes as far as also possession and acquisition, even when you have just acquired the nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, or store or stockpile weapons, of the transportation, or even the supply. So it's a long and the weapons. Proliferation is so it attracts penalties to both a person or organization, where in the event on conviction of such the crime, if you commit any of the activities that we've mentioned above, you facilitate or you conduct a transaction, financial transaction, or provide a financial service or an asset, or get involved in the transportation, sale, supply, acquisition of the weapons of mass destruction. That's the nuclear, biological, or biological weapons. So in the event that you are convicted for that offense, for a person, it attracts the penalty of 20 years or a fine not exceeding 500,000 currency points or both. So that penalty is both for a person and in case of an organization, it applies, but however, note that an organization cannot be imprisoned. So the penalty of imprisonment is for a person, or it can be both the fine and imprisonment for a person. So who does this penalty apply to in case of an organization? If you're an officer or agent that has acquiesced or is an accomplice or participated in the commission of the offense, then you you are subject to this penalty or the fine or imprisonment. So terrorism financing, on the other hand, is willingly collecting funds directly or indirectly by means to a terrorist organization. So you provide financial support to a terrorist organization, whether directly or indirectly. So there is no excuse that you are not actually involved in the actual activity of terrorism, or you have not been caught with the money providing the financial service to a terrorist. The definition is extensive enough also to cover whether you are indirectly, you could be acting on behalf of someone, or you could be acting under the direction of someone. So any direct or indirect involvement to provide any financial support to a terrorist organization is what we refer to as terrorism financing. So in order for you, upon conviction, there are certain ingredients that have to be proven before you're taken on or convicted for terrorism financing. There has to be an element of the intentional knowledge, that you had full knowledge or intention to take part, whether in full or in part, with the activities of the terrorist organization to carry out the terrorist act. So even the participation, it doesn't have to be in full. You can sense that the definition is extensive enough to cover whether in full, whether you have participated in full or in part. So upon conviction or for the offense of terrorism, it's punishable by death upon conviction. So note that once court proves that you had the knowledge that you were committing such the act or intention, whether to participate in full or in part, it attracts the penalty of death. So what do we mean, or what entails terrorist financing? For us to say or conclude that one of the ways that one finances terrorism, it may include having illicit proceeds from occupation of the terrorist territories. So what happens is there's a way that terrorism is linked to the offense of money laundering. Money laundering, mainly, the distinction would be that money laundering, the proceeds of crime originate from an illegal activity, whereas terrorism financing, it does not necessarily mean that the proceeds might originate from an illegal activity. Terrorism financing might be both. You might generate a legit business. You might put up a legit business, mainly to generate funds or proceeds to commit the act of terrorism. So it has both the illicit we mean the illegitimate proceeds obtained from criminal activities. So it has both the element of illicit proceeds and the legitimate proceeds. So kidnapping for ransom, this is also done by terrorists to finance their activities, to get money, whereby they kidnap someone and the condition is for you to pay ransom to release that person. So the funds that they obtain, this is an activity that is undertaken by the criminals, the terrorists, to finance their acts. Also donations, including through NPOs, is another way of financing the acts of terrorism, that is terrorism financing. And I'm glad that part of the group here includes the NPOs, so you can know where you stand, the vulnerability of the institutions to be used for terrorism financing. And you may also want to familiarize yourself with, I'm happy to inform you that we have the Terrorism Financing Risk Assessment for the NPOs that was conducted by FIA, and it's on our website. For the NPOs, you might interest yourself in that, so that you know where you stand as NPOs in regards to the terrorism financing risks. So materials, providing materials, material support associated with foreign terrorist fighters. So also provision of material support is an indication or is a way of financing terrorism. Fundraising through modern communication networks is also another way. So terrorism financing may encompass provision of financial support or the assets. For example, the material support items to the terrorist groups, or engaging in activities that can generate funds to finance the activity of terrorism. So according to the United Nations Security Council assessment or survey concerning the channels used for terrorist financing, it indicates that the most predominantly used channel to finance terrorism is for terrorism financing is the banking sector. Then there's also cash smuggling, which the terrorists use. And this, we are a victim of this because of the porous borders, which make it easy to smuggle cash across the high-risk jurisdictions, for example, the DRC Congo. So, which exposes us to a high terrorism financing threat because of our geographical location. Also, the use of money service businesses, the terrorists use this. It's the next in rank, and the use of hawalas, where they send money to an agent, a hawala agent, so that you can receive it from another jurisdiction. And they have an arrangement of how they can get compensated for the amount that they have been given to a criminal who has crossed over to another jurisdiction to receive the money. So it's a cartel that operates in different jurisdictions for ease of transfer of funds, depending on where they intend to commit the act. So that the funds do not go through the banking system for ease of the audit trail. So to conceal the audit trail, this hawala movement, the informal remitters are also used. Use of social media is also another way that the terrorists are using to finance terrorism through recruiting people, and also prepaid cards. The terrorists use that amongst others. So the typologies for proliferation financing, the revenue generating activities to fund the proliferation activities or efforts is one of the ways that criminals use to commit the offense of proliferation financing. For example, through use of NPOs, could be generating activities like use of investing money or getting involved in the casino or play business, or getting involved, investing in the real estate, generate revenue generating activities so that they generate funds to finance the act of terrorism. Remember, we mentioned that terrorism includes both the legit businesses that have been put in place and the illegitimate businesses, that is the proceeds of crime, businesses where terrorists obtain proceeds from criminal activities. So for the legit businesses, it could be a real estate business, could be the casino. I put my money in a casino business, or I get involved in a play in a casino so that I get a win to get more revenue or more money to finance the act of terrorism. Or it could be getting involved in the mineral dealing business to generate revenue so that the criminals can finance their activities. These criminals need money to finance their activities, money to recruit people, money to purchase the equipment. So they also have the idea of putting in place businesses, legit businesses, so that they can generate finances to finance their activities. So why should we, you may ask yourself that why should we prevent or detect proliferation financing? This, if we do not do this, it exposes us to global instability And that means if such acts of proliferation financing, of manufacturing of weapons of mass destruction, or manufacturing funds that turn out to be bombs or explosive materials, they can lead to loss of life. And also the global instability, it affects the global peace and security. So that's why it calls for a combined effort across the jurisdictions or different countries, the international cooperation, because it is a transnational crime that goes beyond borders. It affects all countries, so hence the need for the combined effort to prevent the loss of life and the global instability. So it also has an effect on the reputational damage of a country, because look at it this way, if you are an investor, you wouldn't want to invest in a country that is not stable when it comes to, or when it comes to the protection of lives of others. So most so investors shy away from such jurisdictions, and this undermines the revenue of the country or investments in a country. So this is why we are calling on, this explains the drive why we are advocating for this and why the FATF advocates for the combating of proliferation of financing and terrorism financing. So there's the legal framework that governs the combating of terrorism financing and proliferation financing. And we shall start with the FATF recommendations 4, 5, 6, and 7. So the Financial Action Task Force, that's FATF, it's the international body that is charged with the responsibility of formulating standards, the international standards on combating money laundering, terrorism financing, and proliferation financing. So these standards are 40 in number. They're hence called the FATF 40 recommendations. So these are recommendations that we have to put in place or implement. All countries that subscribe to this international body have to make sure they implement. And one of them is recommendation 4, that provides that all countries need to criminalize terrorism and terrorism financing as well, in recommendation 4 and 5. 6 and 7 is advocating for countries to put, 4 is criminalizing money laundering, and 5 is criminalizing terrorism financing. So 6 and 7 is on the implementation of targeted financial sanctions. The FATF is advocating for countries to implement targeted financial sanctions for terrorism financing. That is recommendation 6. And recommendation 7 to implement targeted financial sanctions for proliferation financing, to ensure that countries do not make funds available so that those terrorist organizations or terrorists also make funds available to those involved in proliferation financing. We shall discuss in detail what we mean by implementing targeted financial sanctions that these recommendations are advocating for. So you see, the legal framework encompasses of the international context. That's where we borrow from the international, the FATF standards, the international standards, and also the domestic legal framework as per Uganda, our legal framework. It encompasses the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2002, and this has had several amendments. That's the 2015, 17, 22, and currently the amendment regulations of 2023. So you may ask yourself, why do we have all these amendments? Why do they keep changing? We are trying to respond to the FATF recommendations, because under recommendation 4 and 5, they recommend us to criminalize terrorism financing as per the UN Convention on Suppression of Terrorism. So you find that if our law at that time didn't have an extensive definition of what terrorism financing is, we had to amend the law to ensure that it suits what the FATF recommendations are advocating for in relation to the UN conventions on suppression of terrorism and disruption of activities on proliferation financing or proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So in regard also still, we have the Anti-Money Laundering Act. Now this guides us on the implementation of measures to combat money laundering. Remember, money laundering can, the proceeds obtained from money laundering can also be used to commit the act of terrorism. So since we mentioned that terrorism has both illicit proceeds and the legit proceeds. So the illicit proceeds could be proceeds that have been obtained with the intention to disguise or proceeds obtained from a criminal activity, that is money laundering. So when there's an element of money laundering, proceeds that have been used to commit the act of terrorism, make reference to that's why we borrow from the Anti-Money Laundering Act. To convict anyone who is involved in that terrorism act to prove the offense of money laundering. So the anti-terrorism amendment regulations, these repealed the regulations of 2016, also to address the identified deficiencies by the party that we had not provided. We had no legal framework to provide for targeted financial sanctions. So we had to come up or enact the anti-terrorism amendment regulations of 2023. We have the regulations, anti-money laundering regulations. These guide the implementation of the Anti-Money Laundering Act. And these have also been amended in 2023, responding to the strategic deficiencies that were identified. So you see all the laws are responding to address the identified deficiencies as you have been briefed in the background given by Mr. Ngobi. So the regulations on anti-money laundering, Uganda had not provided for the sanction regime for money laundering. So we had to amend the regulations to provide for the administrative sanctions. And now you may need to refer to this because each area of breach of compliance attracts a penalty, and you may need to know that once you fail or fall short of your obligations, what penalty does it attract? For example, failure to register with FIA, what penalty does it attract? Failure to file the reports to FIA, what penalties does it attract? So this is the anti-money laundering amendment regulations that provide for administrative sanctions. We have the targeted financial sanction guidelines for accountable persons, and these are on our website. You may need to refer to these after this discussion or this training for an elaborate understanding or extensive knowledge on what we are discussing today. So to dive into what sanctions are, when we hear the word sanctions, what rings to our minds? These are restrictive measures adopted by an organization, and they are adopted on a country, could be an entity or a person. And the main objective of this is to maintain peace and security. How do they do? They put in place restrictive measures to change or to constrain you as a country or as a person or as an identified designated entity so that there's a change in behavior. It could be that you have violated the human rights. Could be that as a country you are engaged in production of weapons of mass destruction. It could be that you are engaged as a person, you have committed the act of terrorism, or you're engaged in financing terrorism, or you're a suspect of terrorism. So these restrictive measures that have been put in place or adopted by an organization to constrain you so that you get back in line and you change behavior in order to maintain the peace and security. So the main objective of sanctions is to maintain the peace and security. What are the categories of sanctions that we have? They range, and we have some that target countries, and we have the sanction regimes also. For example, the UN sanction regime, the European Union sanction regime, and the Office of the Financial Assets Control sanction regime. Those are the ones for US. So the sanctions may involve the travel bans, asset freezes, arms embargo, and sectoral sanctions. So these are the restrictive measures that can be put in place to ensure that a country or designated person or entity is falls back in line or is constrained so that you change behavior. If you have been committing any act that destabilizes the peace and security, the global peace, then these sanctions can be imposed. Travel ban, like prevention of travel of a person, whoever has been designated to be a terrorist, to commit in acts of profession financing. For example, the UN sanction regime dictates that all member states have to ensure that they put in place these sanctions, for example, to deter any individual that has been designated from traveling to any of the countries. So once you subscribe to the UN, you have to implement these, ensure that there's a travel ban on whoever has been sanctioned. And the UN circulates this information as to who the travel ban is should be applied to. Asset freezes, if in the event that the UN provides such information of the designated persons, then it calls on all member states to take a move to ensure that they hold or they freeze the funds of such individuals to make sure that they do not access any financial service or provide any financial service or transaction to such identified individuals. Arms embargoes could be where certain countries that are dealing in arms or explosive weapons, there are sanctions that are imposed on such countries where member states are called upon also not to deal or involve or have any engagement with such countries. For example, the Democratic Republic of Korea. And sectoral sanctions now, these are mainly restricting a specific area of the sector. Could be maybe production of weapons of mass destruction. So the sanction regimes, the respective sanction regimes call upon members to deter member countries from dealing with such countries that have been restricted from dealing in such activities. So sanctions are imposed, for example, we have the UN sanctions that are imposed by the sanction committees, and these details can be obtained from the UN website. So implementing targeted financial sanctions, therefore, requires that transposition of the UN sanction regimes into our national laws. You would find that we have the European Union sanction regime. Now these ones apply to all countries that fall under the European Union. There are restrictive measures that are imposed by the European Union, mostly also in third world countries. They could be in form of withdrawal of aid to the countries once they detect that you are engaged in an activity that destabilizes the peace and security. So these European countries also embed these European Union countries that fall in the European Union also implement the UN sanctions. So the UN sanctions are multilateral in nature. They apply to most countries, and also the OFAC, the Office of the Foreign Asset Control, now the sanction regime. Then this sanction regime is for the US. So the United States, which applies to all the nationals and the aliens or residents of the United States or entities that are incorporated in the US, or also their branches that operate across the globe. They're supposed to implement these sanctions that once the US designates a person or entity, all the US nationals or residents are supposed to implement these sanctions. So it's the Office of the Foreign Asset Control that implements these sanctions, hence called the OFAC sanction regime. So on top of that, much as they have their sanction regime, they also incorporate the United Nations sanction regime. And since we said that the United Nations sanction regime advocates for the transposition of this regime into the national laws, and we have explained how the European Union adopts the United Nations sanction regime, the same applies to the US, and also the same applies to us as Uganda. as you will see in the Anti-Terrorism Regulations 2023, that requires our minister to designate persons who are required to be designated by the United Nations Security Council resolutions. So the UN sanctions are implemented or following the United Nations Security Council resolutions. There are different respective Security Council resolutions that are passed, designating different individuals or entities that we are not supposed to deal with. So in our national framework or national measures, we also have to implement the UN sanction regime following any United Nations Security Council resolution under Regulation 10 of the Anti-Terrorism Amendment Regulations of 2023. So you see that we integrate the UN sanction regime into our laws, the same for the European Union and the same for the US. In the same way, the FATF has also integrated the same aspects of the United Nations sanctions into the FATF standards. And the FATF recommendations 6 and 7 requires that countries need to implement the targeted financial sanctions related to terrorism and terrorism financing. On the other hand, recommendation 7 is advocating for implementation of targeted financial sanctions for proliferation financing. And there's what they call the immediate outcomes. These are the benchmarks on what the FATF assesses us on. They're the objectives, the main objectives of the FATF recommendations. What is the outcome when you implement the recommendation A, B, and C? So FATF expects that we need to have an outcome under immediate outcome 10, where we have a system that does not allow those dealing in proliferation financing from raising, moving, or using funds, or where we ensure under immediate outcome 11 that we prevent immediate outcome 11 that we prevent proliferation, anyone dealing in proliferation financing from moving or raising funds. And under immediate outcome 10, we prevent terrorist organizations or terrorists from moving, raising, or using funds. So the end objective in mind should be that as a country, we need to make sure that we prevent either terrorist organizations, terrorists, proliferation financiers, or those who deal in proliferation of weapons of mass destruction from raising, moving, or using funds. And how we are going to do that is by implementing these targeted financial sanctions that we are speaking about. Remember, we mentioned sanctions are constraints, so we need to implement these constraints as stipulated in the United Nations Financial Prohibitions, Arms Embargo, and Travel Ban Sanctions Act. So this is the act that introduces the targeted financial sanctions. It is the act that empowers the United Nations Sanctions Security committees to pass resolutions regarding any designation of a person or entity and call upon member states to implement those sanctions. And it provides for the targeted financial sanctions. So these include the freezing, prohibition against the dealing with the assets, could be financial prohibition through freezing of funds of the parties. So whoever the UN designates as a terrorist or has committed the acts of proliferation financing or proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, it calls upon member states to freeze, to deny or prohibit any dealings with such individuals, with such terrorist organizations, with such persons, or prevent such persons, or we should not also provide any financial service to such persons, whoever has been designated by the UN. So another targeted financial sanction introduced by this act is prohibition against making assets of financial services under Section 24, which we have discussed, and also arms embargo, where we prevent any movement of the arms into our countries or dealing with such countries that deal in these related materials, or countries that deal in providing assistance to the designated groups, terrorist organizations, for example, the Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. So the UN calls upon member states to refrain from dealing with such countries that are involved in this. So also travel ban, restriction of movement of such designated persons that maybe belong to a terrorist organization or that may belong to, for example, Al-Qaeda, or disengage any engagement with such persons. So it is the United Nations Financial Prohibitions, Arms Embargo and Travel Ban Sanctions Act that gives us the powers to implement the UN sanction regime. And that lists or gives us an indication of what targeted financial sanctions are, which includes freezing, arms embargo, travel ban, or asset seizing assets of these designated persons. So therefore, the UN sanctions, when we speak of the UN sanctions, we speak of those sanctions where the UN designates, imposes such sanctions to prevent terrorism financing, terrorism and preferential financing is the main objective of these sanctions. Putting all these embargoes on these individuals, on these entities, on these terrorist organizations, the main objective is to counter or prevent terrorism financing and the preferential financing. The purpose of freezing the funds is to distort their activities, to make sure that we distort all their financial plans so that they are not in position to recruit, they are not in position to produce any dangerous weapons, they are not in position to purchase any dangerous equipment. So that's the main idea behind imposing the sanctions. The end result, the end goal in mind is to counter terrorism, terrorism financing, preferential financing, and to prevent proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So the UN sanctions are directed, as we have discussed, to either countries, individuals, or entities, and all member states have to implement these, and Uganda is a member state of the UN, therefore it has to implement these. They are passed by the United Nations Security Council, which gives us the measures that we need to undertake in regards to the sanctions that have been passed by the respective sanction committees. There are respective sanction committees for terrorism financing, for preferential financing. So whichever sanction committee that sanctions an individual, we are supposed to comply. Any United Nations Security Council resolution that has been passed by the UN in regards to designation of an individual, a terrorist or an entity, we are supposed to comply as a member state of the UN. So the UN sanctions are categorized into two. There are those that refer to terrorism financing and there are those that refer to proliferation financing. We've been speaking of United Nations Council resolutions. So this is the point where you see that the United Nations Security Council resolution designated individuals that belong to the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So it called upon member countries under the United Nations Security Council resolution of 1999 to refrain from dealing with anyone that belongs to the group of the Al-Qaeda, or condemning, and the main objective was condemning those that were distorting the peace of Afghanistan. So all member countries under this United Nations Security Council resolution were supposed to ensure that they disengage, or it calls upon member countries to implement the targeted financial sanctions that we've spoken about, to immediately freeze the funds once they realize that they have a client who is an affiliate or who is attached to this group, the Al-Qaeda, or wants to seize the property of all the clients once they realize that they have a match of these individuals that the UN has designated, or whether these individuals or their client is attached to this Al-Qaeda, or also impose travel bans to this individual into the country, whether they belong to, whether they are an affiliate of this group. So we have another sanction regime against that was passed by the UN. that calls for disengagement of the countries from anyone or any affiliate of Osama or anyone who is dealing under the Al-Qaeda or the Taliban group or Osama. So all member countries, and of which Uganda is a member country of the UN, we are supposed to take immediate action by freezing all the funds once you realize that you have a client who belongs or who is an affiliate of such the group that has been designated by the UN. So those that relate to profession financing include the United Nations Council resolution in relation to DPRK, the Democratic Republic of Korea. This is in relation to the production of weapons of mass destruction. So it calls upon member countries to disengage from having any dealings with the Democratic Republic of Korea by the virtue of the fact that they deal in proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So this is, as we have discussed, the forms of targeted financial sanctions. There are restrictions that are imposed on a country. So you see here, the Democratic Republic of Korea, there are restrictions that are calling upon member countries to disengage from having any financial dealings or any transactions to the Democratic Republic of Korea because they are involved in production of weapons of mass destruction. There's also another United Nations Security Council resolution that was passed in regards to Iran, where it calls upon member countries to disengage from dealing with Iran by the virtue of the activities that Iran is involved in. So what does it look like when it comes to combating proliferation financing supervision in Uganda? The central authority that is in charge of designations of terrorist organizations is the Ministry of Internal Affairs. And there could be, how the designations happen, they could be designations that are done domestically or designations responding to the requests, foreign requests. A foreign country can request through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here to designate a terrorist or individual or terrorist organization. So normally the foreign requests are channeled through the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who requests the Minister of Internal Affairs to designate a terrorist organization. And now the Minister of Internal Affairs instructs the Inspectorate of Police to examine or collect information to establish whether there is reasonable grounds to conclude that this person is a suspected terrorist, this person is involved in proliferation financing. So what the Inspectorate of Government does now, this is where we come in, all the accountable persons. The role of the Inspectorate of Police is to collect information, gather evidence, to have a strong ground to commit or declare this person as a terrorist. It could be financial transactions, or it could be dealings in a casino, for example, calling on for any information from the casino of whoever the foreign country has requested to designate, could be calling on for financial transactions in the real estate business, calling on the real estate agents to provide such information. So the investigation of the Inspectorate of Government encompasses engagements with different supervisory authorities, different entities, the FIA, the police. And the main objective of this is to establish the reasonable grounds to conclude whether this person should be designated as a terrorist organization or a terrorist person who has committed terrorism. So upon establishing the reasonable grounds, then the declaration is made by the Minister of Internal Affairs, who through the Minister of Foreign Affairs now would notify the United Nations Sanction Committee to designate the person. So that is how the combating of proliferation financing supervision looks like in Uganda. For the foreign requests, they are channeled through the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who instructs the Minister of Internal Affairs. So the Minister of Internal Affairs now is the one in charge of designating, make all the designations, terrorist organization, whether domestically, whether he identifies a terrorist group domestically here, or whether he's responding to a foreign request. So what does it look like when it comes to implementing sanctions in Uganda? The sanction pillar, we would summarize it to encompass the designations. It starts with the designations, then it trickles down to identifying persons and assets through screening. So when the designation information has come out, which we shall see that FIA circulates to all accountable persons who have logged on here, you're all accountable persons. So when that information comes out, then the next step is for us to identify whether we have these persons that have been designated. And the designations could be mainly our minister here who was designated locally, or it could be upon a foreign request, or it could be responding to the UN demands following the United Nations Security Council resolution. So upon designations, whichever kind, whether by the minister, whether foreign request, whether responding to the human sanction regime, then we embark on identifying whether we have such persons, and we start to look for where the funds are for such persons, if we have such persons as identified in our entities. Then after that, we need to take the immediate action to freeze and also monitor compliance. So this is how now we implement the targeted financial sanctions in our domestic sanction regime. So to start with the designation, as I've mentioned in brief, the designations could be by the UN, calling on all member states to designate whichever terrorist organizations or terrorists or individuals. And the UN makes amendments to these sanctions lists. So once it calls upon member countries to react following the United Nations Security Council resolution, we are supposed to react accordingly, to immediately also designate such persons. So the designations could be through formal expressions from the UN, responding to the UN designations, or us designating locally by the minister and requiring informing the United Nations Sanction Committee to designate whoever has been declared as a terrorist. So for the designations by the UN, they include the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, or the sanction regime for the DPRK, where we are supposed to disengage or from having any commercial dealings with the Democratic Republic of Korea, or having any dealings with Osama bin Laden and the Taliban. So that's what it looks like to respond to the UN sanction designation. On the other hand, the designation could take the direction of a minister designating, as we have discussed, and these designations are detailed in Regulation 5 of the Anti-Terrorism Regulations 2020, where persons are designated by the minister in accordance with the United Nations Sanction Security Committee resolutions, and also the Sanctions Council resolutions, and also if the minister may designate suspected terrorists under Regulation 7. So designations, the minister may also designate those dealing in proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So what is the role of FIA in implementing targeted financial sanctions? As FIA, we circulate information regarding whoever has been designated as a terrorist in relation to the UN sanction regime, and we call upon members or entities or accountable persons to respond accordingly and immediately freeze the funds of such individuals that have been designated, or respond to any amendment of the sanction list as has been issued by the UN, and call upon members to seize properties if they indicate that they have a match of such persons. So the UN provides a sanction list that it keeps amending, and as removing individuals or adding individuals. So as and when they remove, we as FIA, we're supposed to disseminate such information so that you move. And upon receipt of that information, you are required to check your databases to identify if there is a match of such entities or individuals, and take action by freezing or seizing properties of such individuals. So the freezing and seizing of properties, now there you will be implementing the targeted financial sanctions that we have spoken of, because targeted financial sanctions encompasses financial prohibitions such as freezing or seizing of property, or arms embargo, where the Ministry of Internal Affairs deters such individuals from moving into the countries, or arms embargo, where we do not deal with countries that deal in production of the arms. So Regulation 12 provides that once you have identified, 12.9 of the anti-terrorism regulations provides that once you have identified that you have a match of an individual that has been designated based on the information that FIA has circulated. And remember, FIA is also responding to the updates provided by the United Nations sanction regime following the United Nations Security Council resolution. So once you identify that you have a match, then what next? What are you supposed to do? So your obligation, this requires you to inform FIA immediately and provide the details. What kind of details? Details of any attempted transaction of that person, the names and addresses of whoever has been designated. What time are you freezing this account, or what time are you holding these funds of this designated person? What's the balance on account of this person and other related accounts or balance? So mainly you capture the details of whoever this match, what are their addresses, who is the property holder, the name of the holder of this property, where is the property located, the description of the property in case it's a real estate. So under Regulation 12.9, it requires you to avail us with those details. Where is the property located? So immediately upon the freeze and seizing the property, you are supposed to report to FIA in a timely manner. So when you report to FIA, you avail us with these details. What was the mode or date of acquisition of this property, or where the funds coming from, in case it's the funds that you have identified that you hold for this match, for this person who has been designated by the United Nations. So we mentioned that the sanction pillar starts with designations. Designations could be by the minister, could be responding to the United Nations sanction regime who has been added to the list, who has been removed from the list. It also could be the minister here designated locally a terrorist organization based on our local list. So then what next? We are supposed to screen as accountable persons or as entities. You screen, the main objective of screening is for you to identify, to try to establish if you have such a person as a client, if you have such a person who engages in this sector, that your respective sectors. So we encourage that the screening has to take place from the onboarding. When you onboard this client, at the point of the client walking up to you, wanting to engage in your business, or you taking on a client, you are supposed to try to find out if they fall, if there's a match with the list that was circulated by FIA, to identify whether this person is sanctioned or not. So what's in the screening of these persons, you're looking out for who are the account holders, if it's an account that they hold, who are the signatories, to see, are they designated persons, are they suspect terrorists, are they persons from countries that are dealing in proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, for example, the Democratic Republic of Korea, that we are supposed to disengage or not have any financial dealings, economic financial dealings with. So you also screen to find out the directors and the beneficial owners of the companies that you deal with. Are they, is it a match to the list, the information that FIA has circulated, or to the information that the UN sanction list is providing? Anyone with the access of the account or exercising the control of the account. Remember, we said involving in proliferation financing may be either direct or indirectly. So the criminals are also wise. They may not have the direct involvement on in the financial dealings or financial services. They may use someone who acts on behalf of them. So you try to find out if any of your clients has any attachment to these designated terrorist organizations or groups, or there are any transactions that have been made to such countries dealing in proliferation financing or such terrorist organizations that have been designated by the United Nations. So the screening is both onboarding and it is ongoing. And how to screen it could be automated or manual. Though we note that financial institutions, for them, they have the automatic screening where they just type in the name. And they have the sanction list embedded into the software. They type in the name and it gives them whether it's a match or not a match. It flags those who have been sanctioned, those who are on the sanction list as and when they amend the list. So manual screening can also be done depending on the size of the sector, because we are supposed to use a risk-based approach. You undertake measures responding to the risk that you're exposed to or the nature of the business that you're exposed to. So there are no exceptions to screening. Either way, you have to screen, whether automated or manual screening, and all transactions have to be screened regardless of the amount. So you might not say that this property is worth 10 million. That's little money. I don't need to find out whether this client is sanctioned, or this property is 5 million. I don't need to find out whether this person is sanctioned or not. That I will only find out for the big properties, 100 billion. No. There is no limit as regards to the thresholds when it comes to screening. From the onboarding stage, you must try to identify if you have a match of those that have been designated. And also, it doesn't stop at that. You have to continuously monitor the transactions of those clients. If it's a real estate business, if it's a casino business, consistently monitor the play of this client involved in the casino business, or this company of the casino or a person who has invested in the casino sector. So you constantly monitor the incoming and outgoing transactions. Some of the red flags could include, are they moving transactions to countries that deal in production of weapons of mass destruction? Or is your client coming from a country that deals in production of weapons of mass destruction? And in this transaction monitoring, you're trying to establish, or you're trying to view the incoming and outgoing transactions of the client. So for the real estate business, for example, you try to, if it's a one-off transaction, it might be hard for you to monitor the business when it comes to transaction of this client. But if it's a client, the repetitive client that comes on and wants to invest in the real estate business, maybe probably this time invest in 100 billion building, and next time you invest in a 10 billion much more money than that. So you constantly monitor the profile of your clients to see whether there's any red flag for you to identify, or first, in the first place, you first screen to see if this client is a potential match in regards to the list that was circulated when it comes to the UN sanction list. So the purpose of constant monitoring of these clients is to see that if there's anything that does not speak, because you can know your client, you can know the transaction profile of this client, and there could be a shoot in the investment to a much more expensive business, rather to a much more expensive building, or a play involved in a casino that involves a huge sum of amount. So once you detect that this person is a match, and then all the funds attached to this person, then you're supposed to freeze once you have identified a potential match. So in the transaction monitoring, you need to capture the details of the parties involved, if it's any bank, if there's any involvement of the bank transactions, the bank name, and any other institutions or intermediaries. So the criminals are also wise. They are not the very actual ones that come to take out all business with you or involve in the sector. They might engage other intermediaries to conceal their identity. So you take note of also, you screen the intermediaries to see if there's a match, if they have any engagement with the affiliated groups that have been designated by the United Nations. under the United Nations sanction list. So there are techniques that the criminals use to evade sanction screening. For example, the use of front companies or shell companies. One opens up a company, but just for purposes of passing through transactions. So they use that so that they are not the very ones that are transacting. So you cannot know who is behind a company, or they use a front company. You cannot know who is hiding behind a company. So some of the indicators that you can find out if you have any engagement with the shell companies or front companies, then you might want to take enhanced due diligence measures to find out who is behind a company, because most cases it's a complex structure. They create companies behind a company, then another company, until you land on who is the actual beneficial owner of the company. So they also form joint ventures to make it hard for you to screen them, because if they have a joint venture with other legitimate businesses, you might overlook that because they are involved in the legitimate businesses. So you need to take note of that it's not only the illegitimate businesses, but also the legit businesses where they have joint ventures with them. Entities that have a complex structure or opaque ownership, where it's not easy to establish who is the owner of the company, you need to take note of that, because they use this, the criminals use this to make sure that they hide so that you do not easily screen them. You need to identify the routing of the transactions. If you detect that there's any routing of transactions, that's an indicator that something is not right. So you need to take note of that. This the criminals use very much in order to evade the sanction screening. Mixing of the illicit proceeds in the businesses, mixing of the illicit proceeds and the illicit proceeds in the businesses. So they engage in the legitimate businesses, could be the real estate, could be the casinos, could be the NGOs. So that commingling of funds to taint a picture that the business is actually legit, there is no need to query this business. The criminals do that a lot, so in order to evade the sanction screening. So it does not mean that you do not screen because the business looks legit. There are criminals also that can hide through the legitimate businesses. They use the non-DPRK, the Democratic Republic of Korea nationals. So not only the nationals of the Democratic Republic of Korea that you need to look out for, but also the non-nationals. Also disassociating logistics from the financial trail. This is very common that you also need to take care of, because it's a technique that they use to evade the sanction screening. They liaise, also use falsified documentation. You need to take care of it, to be mindful of this, and using bank accounts of non-listed parties. The most cases in the NPOs, we see the donors using bank accounts of the staff themselves, the owners of the NPOs, the executive directors. So criminals can also use this. So it doesn't mean that you don't screen the donor because, or you don't screen the donor because it's an account that has been, the account that has been used is for the staff. So offshore front and shell companies, if you have a client that is an offshore company, a company that is based outside Uganda, you need to be mindful of this, because the criminals also use this to disguise or hide the beneficial owner. They really don't want you to understand who is the ultimate beneficial owner of the company. So they try to use the offshore or front or shell companies. We have discussed the joint ventures, so you need to take note of this. And another way, the virtual currencies, because of their anonymity, they attract the anonymous use. It's not easy to capture the details of who has sent the money or from where. So they like the use of virtual currencies. So if any of the client is engaging you in the payment through virtual currencies, it's something that you need to take note of. So situations that may indicate sanction screening evasion. If they are, how can you know that they are evading sanction screening? If the customers are linked, if your customers are linked to high-risk jurisdictions or businesses. For example, you have a client who wants to buy property, but the client is coming from a high-risk jurisdiction. How can you know the high-risk jurisdiction? There's a list on the Financial Action Task Force or website, and even FIA notifies all accountable persons of the countries that have been added on that list of high-risk jurisdictions. We as a country, Uganda, we are on that list of high-risk jurisdictions. So you need to take note of the customers that you deal with to identify whether they are from high-risk jurisdictions. So complex OPEX structures, we have mentioned that in your dealings, these are very common, so you need to take care of this. It would give you an indication of whether these targeted, sanctioned individuals are hiding behind the complex structures. Where you see any customer who has had a previous dealing with a listed party, take a note of that and inform FIA or immediately. So any involvement in any party named in the UN panel. So any involvement, all right, so how you need to keep track of the sanction evasion techniques as DNFVPs, you need to be cognizant of the indicators of sanction evasion that we have mentioned above. The existence of the joint ventures with the legitimate businesses, the complex structures that the criminals create, the customers that are coming from high-risk countries, the front companies that have been created. So you need to take note of that so that you get an indication of whether the clients are hiding their identities, and you also can know whether there are any transactions that pathways that these designated individuals are trying to obscure, so that you do not get to know that they are attached to any terrorist organization. So in your dealings, take note of any hidden identities and the transaction pathways that the criminals take to obscure any connection from the designated persons. So can we take a break of 5 minutes? Then as we come back, we are going to dive into the red flags or indicators that will help you know who you're dealing with in relation to the customer behavior, how your customer will be behaving. A break of 5 minutes, then we shall be back. As we take a break, you can feel free to type any questions so far where we have reached in the chat that we shall respond to. Yes, we are back. So that we finish the last session of the training, and we had left at a point where we were going to discuss the red flags or indicators that can enable you to identify if you're dealing with a person or anyone that has an attachment to a designated person or entity. So the red flags for you would involve a customer. If you have a customer that is dealing in the supply or sale or purchase of dual use products or proliferation sensitive products. There are products that serve a dual use purpose. For example, uranium. It could be used in the production of weapons of mass destruction, and also could be used for other products, maybe in phones. So that's what we mean by the dual use products. The chemicals that are used for dual use could be used for production of the legitimate materials or items, and at the same time they could be used as explosives or dangerous or sensitive, proliferation sensitive goods. So if you have a customer that deals in such products or purchases in such products that have a dual use, they could be both legitimate or illegitimate by their nature. They fall under the category of explosives, and they can also be used for production of legit products. So if you have such a customer, or if you have anyone that deals, if you identify that you have a customer that deals in the supply of such materials, that is a customer behavior that would give you a red flag in order for you to sense that you need to do the sanction screening to identify whether this person is a designated person or has an attachment to the persons that have been designated or terrorist organizations, or the person deals in proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So that's a red flag that you need to look out for. And once you identify that, you need to file a suspicious transaction to FIA. So if you have a customer and their address is similar to an individual or entity that has been publicly designated as a sanctioned person or on the sanction list. So if their address match the address that was given in the description of the sanction list, the persons that are indicated on the sanction list, you need to identify such persons and inform FIA immediately. So that would be a red flag, any match in the addresses identified in relation to those on the publicly available sanction list. So you need to also look out for anyone connected to the jurisdictions of proliferation concern. You need to take note of that and not to deal with such persons. Remember the UN sanction regime. When the sanctions lists are issued, they could be against a country countries that are dealing in proliferation financing, or entities that are dealing in proliferation financing, or individuals. So it's important to take note of the jurisdiction where the customer is coming from. It's very key, because the sanction regimes call upon us to disengage with anyone who is coming from a jurisdiction of proliferation concern. So if there's, you need to also take note of the customer's business profile. So your customer business profile is important in the sense that if you've known your customer to purchase or to involve in a play of a certain amount, and all of a sudden there's a shoot in the amounts, transaction amounts involved, or the amounts in terms of the thresholds, the big thresholds involved, you need to take note of that, because where you know your customer, your knowledge of your customer has changed, there's a shoot in terms of the large amounts that the customer is engaged in, or the customer is engaged in businesses that generate large amounts. So the customer profile, customers' activities profiles, try to establish what does your customer do? Does she engage in activities that deal or have an attachment to preparation activities, or does she engage in activities that do not match their profile, where you knew them to have your knowledge of your customer? So in other words, we're calling on for you must be knowing your customer very well in order for you to realize any inconsistencies in terms of their customer profile. For example, if I want to invest in the real estate sector and I am fond of purchasing properties or purchasing rentals, 1 room or 2 room rentals, and then all of a sudden I'm the very customer who wants to purchase the apartments, maybe 6 or 10 apartments, and pay huge billions of sums of money. So that means your knowledge of customer, you need your customer to, your transaction knowledge, your knowledge of a customer was of low value amounts, engaging in the purchase or of rentals, small real estate businesses from a small scale, but now it has escalated to the big investments. So that's what we mean by the diversion of the customer's activities. So you need to know your customer very well. This is where my customer is at. And now there is just a huge shoot, or there's a diversion. There is an inconsistency. There's an abnormal shoot in the transactions that the customer is involved in, or the activities. Also, in relation to these customer activities, the national risk assessment would guide you. We have issued a national risk assessment, which highlights the different sectors that are ranked high risk and low risk. So this would be a good indication for you to know where your clients fall. And the national risk assessment findings reveal that the real estate sector is high risk mainly because the sector is not regulated. So once there are no controls in the sector, the entry is free. Anyone can enter. There are no safeguards, there are no restrictions, hence posing a high risk to the sector. So that's why the national risk assessment revealed that there is a high risk. The real estate sector is ranked as high risk. Casinos are also ranked as high risk. Lawyers are ranked as high risk. And accountants are medium low. Virtual asset service providers are ranked as high risk. So why am I mentioning that the national risk assessment is a good key guidance document for you? Once you get a client, in whichever sector you fall into, you need to make use of the findings here so that you know, if I have a client who is dealing in the real estate business, who wants to play in the casinos, that means they are coming from a high risk sector. Therefore, I need to take precautions, or try to find out in the first place, screen them at the onboarding, try to find out if there's a match on the sanction list, try to monitor them, and transaction monitoring. Do I know, do I have knowledge of their profile, so that I'm able to detect any deviation or any shoot in terms of any inconsistency in terms of the customer profile. So the different rankings of the risks, depending on which nature of business that your client is coming from. If you have a client as a real estate agent, you have someone who is whose occupation, or who has a forex bureau. The national risk assessment ranks forex bureaus as medium. So you need to take note of that so that you know it's a red flag for you to identify. Or if you have a client who has a casino, or who involves in the casino business, and the casinos are ranked as high. So someone who wants to purchase property and runs a casino, so you would know who you're dealing with, and why they want now to invest in the real estate. Could be that the red flag there could be that they want to conceal the funds or invest it in the real estate business, so that the audit trail is hard. So that's why we are saying you need to take care of the customer activities and kindly refer to the National Risk Assessment Ranking so that you know which sector is your client coming from. So where there's vague ultimate beneficial owners, we mentioned the opaque structures, where there's creation of complex structures in form of companies. There's a company that is behind a company, then another company was formed behind that company. So you need to take note of that, the vague customer beneficial ownership information, so that it's a red flag for you once you identify that. Therefore, you need to dig deeper to identify, because it could be that the criminals are hiding behind the ultimate beneficiaries. The ultimate beneficiaries now are the actual ones, not the ones hiding behind the companies. There are those that are just fronted, they're just at the front to give a picture that the business is legitimate, yet the actual beneficiaries of the companies or owners of the companies are hiding behind the ones who have been on the front through creation of the front companies. So the vague beneficial ownership, the complexity, or in terms of the structure of the company, you need to take note of that. It's a red flag that you need to be mindful of. So we have discussed complex structures. The main objective is to conceal any connection of goods or, for example, goods that are exported, that you also need to be mindful of. So the final destination of goods, in case it's a company, maybe a mineral dealer that involves export or import of goods, the final destination of goods, you need, if it's unclear from the trade documents, you need to be mindful of that. So transaction patterns, there's also another red flag. So the red flags are categorized into two. We have the customer behavior based on the jurisdiction where the customer is coming from. Is it proliferation associated? The customer, the nature of the customer, is it complex structure if it's a company? Or if it's a company that deals in export or import of goods, does it, if there's the scarcity of information in terms of where the goods are going, that's another red flag. So on the transaction patterns, on the other hand, you need to follow the money to know where is the money coming from and whether the money is going to the high-risk jurisdictions that we have mentioned about. Also transactions involving the dual-use objects that we have mentioned. For example, products that have dual use, there are different products, or could be minerals that have a dual use. They could be used as explosives or dangerous weapons or chemicals, for example, uranium. So such, it could be used as an explosive, or it also could be used in production of gadgets. So such transactions that involve products that have a dual use, whether licensed or not licensed, you need to take precaution of such products. Once you identify that, that's a red flag, and you need to take the necessary measures that we are going to discuss. The adequate information about that customer. That's the point where you try to ask what the extensive information, the enhanced due diligence on such customers to establish what is the purpose of this product, what are you dealing in, what is the nature, what is your occupation, so that you get to understand in depth. You have complete customer knowledge of what your customer deals in to clear the suspicion. Once the suspicion is not cleared, then you need to report to FIA. So also transactions involving an entity or countries of proliferation concern. So we have noted that the most important thing, take note of countries that involve proliferation concern, whether the customer is coming from there, whether the transactions are heading there, originating from there, or going there. So if you have customers that engage in transactions from there, or that come from jurisdictions of proliferation concern, that's a red flag and that you need to take care of in order for you to implement targeted financial sanctions. So still Under transaction patterns, if it's a company that involves in a shipment of goods where there's inconsistency with the normal geographical trade patterns, the information does not add up, where the country does not normally export or import, where there are transactions to a country where there's not normally exports or imports to that country of a certain good that is consumed, you need to be mindful of that. Where there's an over or under invoice of the dual use products, which we have explained, because an over invoice would mean that the criminals want to transfer money to the other side to move money through the over invoice, the value attached to the over invoice. And the under invoice is for mainly the purposes of moving these dangerous products so that they do not raise queries on the verifications of the product. So you need to take note of both the over invoice and the under invoice of the dual use products. Products that are sensitive or military goods or trade transactions, such trade transactions of such products, you need to be mindful of. It's a red flag. Once you identify that, you need to report to FIA. Where there are goods or destination to a country that is different from where the proceeds are sent, it's a precaution or it's a red flag that you also need to be mindful of, where someone directs that the goods should be sent to another country, but the money should instead be sent to a different jurisdiction. It's an indicator. So there are also trade-related indicators that you need to be mindful of in relation to shipment of goods, where there are inconsistencies with the normal geographical trade patterns. So if the trade patterns are not adding up, as we have discussed, the inconsistencies in the goods that are consumed, and also where the transactions involve an entity from a proliferation concern. So we discussed the transaction pillar in the first place, that it starts with the designations, which we have discussed through the minister, whether foreign or local, and the UN sanction, United Nations Security Council resolution designation. And also we said upon designation, then we try to identify whether we have a match of such individuals. How do we identify? We try to screen the individuals to see if we have a match on the sanction list. And we also conduct screening from the onboarding, try to identify from the transactions that we have, whether there's a designated person, or try to identify from the trade patterns that we have, whether they are going to a jurisdiction that is attached to proliferation activities, or whether the customer is originating from there, or whether the transactions are coming from there or going from such countries. So we have established upon designation, how do we seek to find out the matches, and when we find the match, now what? That is what takes us to the point of freezing. Once we have identified the match through screening, through sanction screening and onboarding screening of clients, once you engage with them or establish a business relationship with them, then we have to, once we have identified the match, then we have to freeze. Now, this is the implementation of targeted financial sanctions that we are talking of here. And once you freezing calls upon you to try to disengage any financial dealings of such individuals, to deny such persons from accessing the funds once you realize that you have properties or you're holding titles for individuals that have been designated, then you seize such titles and report to FIA. Once you identify as a casino that you're holding money for someone who has come to play and has been identified as a positive match, then you do not pay that person for any win that happens therein. Once you're a dealer in precious stones and metals and you identify that you have a match, then you're also supposed to do the same. If you have a client who wants to purchase the property and has probably, rather to the minerals, and has probably paid to you already, to purchase the minerals, you can hold or freeze that money and do not go ahead to provide the minerals to that client who wants to purchase the minerals once you identify that this person is a designated person. So that's how the sanctions apply. The restrictions from these cartels, the terrorists, the people dealing in preparation financing, to deny them access to any economic resource, to any asset, to any financial service, or to any transaction. So the freezing is extensive in nature. It doesn't mean you freeze only funds. It could be an economic resource, could be an asset. It could be denying them to transact with them. So under Regulation 12.7 of the Anti-Terrorism Regulations, it calls upon us as accountable persons, the dealers in precious stones and metals, the real estate agents, the casinos, the NGOs. We are called upon to immediately freeze once we identify that we have individuals that have a match. Once you identify that you have donors for the NPOs that fall under this sanction list, that is a positive match, then you hold that funds. There's no way that donor can fault you for not having implemented the project. You hold those funds and you instead inform FIA immediately. You do not because donors, how the NPOs operate, donors, there's a red flag where the donor sends donation that I'm going to send you 2 billion, but however, once the 2 billion hits the account, send back 1 billion. So that kind of arrangement, once you realize in a scenario that there is a match, any transactions back to the donors are not allowed, or you have to deny the donor access to those funds and no further implementation of the project, you immediately have to inform FIA. That is what we call immediately freezing the funds. For real estate agents, seizing the property. Or in case you have handled money in case of a buy or sell on behalf of a client, you freeze the funds. So that's under Regulation 12.7 of the Anti-Terrorism Regulations, which calls for all of us accountable persons to ensure that there is immediate freeze once there is a positive match. Once you relate to the sanctions list information that FIA has designated, and you identify that there's a match, not only a match of Fiona is on the list, the exact names, but you need to dig deeper to find out if there are any affiliates of Fiona that you're dealing with. So the dealing with Fiona, it's not only the actual acts of Fiona, but anyone who is acting on behalf of Fiona. You go further, so the investigation is deep. You go further to find out whether there's anyone who is behind Fiona that is acting on their behalf, or whether there's anyone that has an attachment to Fiona or an affiliate. So that is why we started with the definition of preparation financing, to see how extensive it is. It extends to playing part or in full, or whether jointly or directly or indirectly. So freezing, it includes assets owned. That takes us to what I've just discussed. It doesn't only include assets that are attached to the actual preparation acts. You freeze assets also for that are owned directly or indirectly, whether jointly or wholly by anyone that has been designated. So once that happens, then you're supposed to report to FIA, and this is recommended under Regulation 12.8 of the Anti-Terrorism Regulations. So as DNFBPs, what we mean by freezing: do not permit any dealings in respect of any frozen property. And this is what recommendation 12.10 of the Anti-Terrorism Regulations is advocating for, that when you freeze, there has to be no further dealings with that property, just like the literal meaning of freeze, that freezing means you stop there. No further dealings in relation to that property, asset, or funds. So any property that is attached to a declared suspect for terrorist or a terrorist organization, you're supposed to immediately freeze and refrain from any dealings. So, yes. So what do we freeze? The freezing is also has what you freeze. We explained in brief terms. It could be funds or an economic resource. So it has an extensive definition. Funds or property that are owned or controlled by a suspected terrorist himself or a terrorist organizations. As we earlier discussed, that not only those that are tied to the actual act of terrorism or proliferation financing, they could be attached indirectly, or they could be attached by a person who has been controlled. I am Fiona, but I am controlled by a terrorist organization B. So even my funds as Fiona, it doesn't mean that you necessarily look out for that the known declared terrorist organization. No, even me, Fiona, who is acting under or on behalf of the terrorist organization B, my funds have to be frozen. So if I am controlled by any terrorist, if I am controlled by any terrorist organizations, such funds have to be frozen. So in your dealings, that's why screening is important, so that you know if someone has any dealings whatsoever with the designated persons. So even funds that are wholly or jointly owned, it doesn't mean that only if Fiona has been declared as a terrorist, only what is owned by me. No, I could be in a circle and there's funds that are jointly owned, even those are seized. So, or I could have a joint investment with a group of people. So even the fact that I am declared as a suspect or as a terrorist organization, anything, whether wholly owned by me, you freeze or seize. Whether jointly owned by others, whether directly or indirectly, it has to be frozen. So remember, the main objective is for us to distort any financial dealings, to distract the terrorists so that they don't have any access to money. That's why these definitions are extensive. They don't only apply to the actual individual, they go in depth into whether direct or indirect, whether wholly or jointly, whether part or in full. So also funds that have been generated from properties owned or controlled directly. So if you own, if I own property, and then from that property, I get to sell off. Let me say if I own an acre, I get to sell off a 50 by 100, then I purchase somewhere else. So the funds that have derived from this property to purchase somewhere else also have to be frozen. So any property derived or generated from funds or property owned or controlled directly or indirectly has to be frozen. So if you realize that generally in brief terms, any property owned by a terrorist organization, whether directly or indirectly, whether those further properties that they generate from the funds that they initially had has to be frozen. So when it comes to freezing, there's another obligation under the Regulation 6 of the Anti-Terrorism Regulation, Amendment Regulations. How do we then deal with these frozen properties? This Regulation 6 calls us to, gives us direction on how to manage the frozen properties. That for the properties that require active maintenance or management, the court may appoint a property manager. And this property manager has to preserve and return the funds with their revenue when the freezing obligation is lifted. So assuming the funds are in the bank, and remember there's certain interest that any account is that can accrue on an account, or assuming there are contracts that were supposed to be executed on an account in terms of payment. So any amount that was paying, any payment that was pending on that account to go to that account at the point of freezing, once the freezing obligation is lifted, investigations are done and the freezing obligation is lifted, the person is entitled to that interest and the revenue accrued, any payment that was supposed to go to that property. So that's part of the preserving of the frozen funds. However, for you to deal with the frozen funds, it's an offense. Once you deal with the frozen funds, it's an offense. It requires a court order. You must obtain a court order to unfreeze, to enable you to deal with the frozen funds. So contravention of this means you've committed contempt of court, and it attracts a penalty or a fine of 200 currency points for each day you continue in contravention dealing with this frozen property. We mentioned that once the property is frozen, refrain from dealing with such property. So if you deal with such property, it's an offense. So if it's a public body and you continue to deal with such property, it attracts a fine of 2 currency points for each day. You as an entity, you contravene this regulation. So to access the frozen or seized funds, you don't just access them, it has to be their procedures that have to be followed. And this has to be sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council approval. So there's need for you to obtain approval from the United Nations Security Council, of course, through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the respective sanction committee that is under regulation 19.4a. So to deal with the frozen property or seized property, access to the seized property, it's not just automatic that once it's lifted, you can access your property or get back your property. It's only until the United Nations Security Council approves the access for you to get access to that property, and court has to grant that access subject to the approval of the United Nations Security Council. So there are 2 elements here. Court has to grant the access upon when the United Nations Security Council approves, then court grants access. So it's not an automatic pass for you to access the frozen property. There are formalities, court procedures, and also approval from the United Nations Security Council. So court, we have discussed that court may authorize addition to frozen properties, any payments due or obligations due prior to the date of the freezing. So once you have taken immediate actions to implement these targeted financial sanctions that we have discussed under the regulations, the freezing and seizing of properties, what then do we expect from you as DNFVPs, as accountable persons, to ensure that there's effective implementation of these targeted financial sanctions? First of all, we are saying that you need to have the procedures in place that reflect the PF risk assessment. Ask yourself, do you have these procedures in place? Once you onboard the clients, once you take on a client as a real estate agent, try to find out if there is any proliferation financing risk element in this client. How? We mentioned about screening. Try to do a match screening to see if there's any positive match. So that is what demonstrates that you have a risk sensitive approach in your dealings with the clients. The casinos, the same. Once you onboard your clients, they've come to play. Do you first check the sanction list to identify any positive match? Once you have any new clients, you therefore have to do a risk assessment. And what risk assessment? Proliferation financing risk assessment. What does this mean? Identify, is the client coming from a country associated with proliferation financing? Identify, is the client involved in businesses that are related to proliferation financing or production of weapons of mass destruction or production of dangerous weapons or chemicals? So that's what we call the risk assessment. You are risk aware of this person, your customer. You get details from your customer to establish the nature of the customer. First of all, where they are coming, are they attached to those countries? Things that we have discussed prior. Try to establish the customer behavior. So that's what we call you assessing the risk of your customers, the proliferation financing risk of your customers. And it doesn't stop at onboarding, even transaction monitoring. We have mentioned, are there any transactions where one plays in a casino and says, channel my money to a country like the Democratic Republic of Korea. So those are red flags that we have discussed. So this is what we call the risk assessment. Look at the customer nature of the customers that you have, the jurisdictions that they're coming from, the transactions that they are conducting. Are they channeled to the high-risk jurisdictions in terms of preferential financing? So assess the geographic activity. This is what we are mentioning, the jurisdictions, high-risk jurisdictions. Establish whether your clients participate in the dual-use supply chain. So once there's that element, so all this relates to the indicators that we've mentioned. In order for you to have a complete compliance program, to say that you have put in place safeguards to ensure that your business, your real estate company is not used by these proliferators of weapons of mass destruction, to ensure that your casino is not used by these proliferators of weapons of mass destruction. Do you have the robust know your customer? KYC means know your customer procedures, that you know your customer very well, you sanction screen them to identify whether they're coming from high-risk jurisdictions. You monitor their transactions to see if they want to channel funds to preferential financing high-risk jurisdictions, and whether the institution, as an institution, your staff comply with these procedures that you have put in place, that if it's a checklist for these customers, they get adequate information. So having in place policies and procedures to know your customer is very important, and doing a preferential financing risk assessment is also important for you to ensure that you have a robust program to combat preferential financing. So we also advocate for ensuring that you have adequate resources, or you allocate resources to enable you to do enhance enough due diligence on your clients when it comes to terrorism financing risk assessment. So the policies and procedures that you need to put in place must permit timely and effective detection of the funds linked to the terrorism. What do we mean by the policies and procedures? If you have the know your customer policy, it must be detailed enough as an institution to show a roadmap that this is the extensive information that we are going to get from our clients to try to satisfy ourselves that they are not originating from a high-risk jurisdiction, that proliferation jurisdiction. And these are the procedures that we shall go through in the event that we identify that we have a match. These are the procedures. This is how we shall investigate. This is how we shall engage the customer to establish, to gather more information, to clear the suspicion. So that's what we mean, the procedures, policies and procedures in place to enable, to permit timely detection. Also to add on that, for timely detection of funds, also it could be automated procedure. The financial institutions have the automated procedures that detect any outstanding amount that does not match the knowledge of a customer. So if you're doing it manually, do these procedures allow you to detect that today my client purchased rentals and the next time I am able to review and say, but this 100 billion real estate investment doesn't add up. How can someone shoot from a rental to $100 billion investment? How can someone play in a casino, buy chips worth 2 million, and then all of a sudden shoot to buy chips worth 50 million or 100 million? So those inconsistencies, the procedures now have to reflect all that. How are you going to be in position to identify the inconsistencies in terms of the customer risk profile, preferential risk profile? How are you going to be in how are the procedures, the detailed procedures? How are you narrating? What information are you going to get from the customers that will satisfy you that they are not from a preferential country, or they are not dealing in activities in sectors that, or businesses, or trading in such goods that are explosive, or that are weapons of mass destruction, or they are nuclear weapons or chemical weapons? So as an institution, the way you have human resource policies and procedures, the way you have a human resource manual, it's the same way we are advocating for and procedures. and these have to have a full detail on how you will detect these people dealing in profession financing or terrorism financing, how you will monitor the transactions or dealings of these people. So it's a document that has the narration of how you will implement all these that we are talking about. So as we have mentioned, the policies should address the positive matches. How do you identify them? How do you investigate? And also the timelines to report to FIA that for us, we investigate within 7 working days, or not 7 is long, we investigate within 2 working days. And in the next 6 hours or 4 hours, we file a report to FIA once we have satisfied ourselves that there's reasonable grounds to believe that this person is originating from a preferential country, a high-risk jurisdiction, to believe that this customer behavior is attached to their red flags in relation to the transaction patterns, their red flags in relation to the customer behaviors. So in addition, you need to train your employees as DNFVPs. The same way we are passing on this information to you to sensitize you about your obligations to combat preferential financing, to implement targeted financial sanctions, you also have to sensitize your employees. How do you do sanction screening? What procedures will they follow internally? Every institution has internal procedures, they differ, but do your employees, are they aware of these internal procedures, of these policies that you have put in place? And how do you communicate these policies to them effectively? Do you, for example, create like sessions where you take them through? For example, our website has the guidelines on implementation of targeted financial sanctions, where you choose on a section on the obligations, for example, what we are discussing now, and you take them through their obligations? Or do you take them through the timelines in your policies and procedures so that they are aware they shouldn't sit on a report, on a suspicious transaction report for more than 7 days, because their policy says freeze immediately and report to FIA. So that awareness is what we are advocating for, is what we are saying. In order for you to have, or in order for us as a country to have effective implementation of targeted financial sanctions, we need to pass on this information to the staff, because if you know better, then we can do better. That is why we are doing this training. So another compliance duty that you need to take care of in the due diligence measures that you undertake, you need to take the approach of a risk-based approach. Once you have done a risk assessment for your customers, you have assessed your customers, and you know that from our customers that we have, these are high risk, these are low risk, these are medium risk. So the high risk would be those from high risk jurisdictions. For example, Uganda, we are on a list of high risk jurisdictions. So any client that you have from a high risk jurisdictions, for example, South Africa is on the list of high risk jurisdictions. Nigeria is on the list of high risk jurisdictions. So in your risk ranking now, those would be ranked as high risk by the nature of the jurisdictions that they come from. So risk sensitive, being risk sensitive, now we are saying that due diligence that you adopt, your focus will be more on the high risk clients that you have, in terms of ensuring that you get extensive information about the customers that you have from those jurisdictions, enhanced due diligence. That is what we mean by being risk focused. So upon doing the preparation financing risk assessment, where the customer is originating, where the transactions going, what nature of businesses do they do? As we have discussed, you can refer to the National Risk Assessment to identify the nature, the occupations where these clients of yours fall, to know where they fall in a high risk sector or low risk. So those are the indicators that can help you conclude, profile your clients, whether they're high risk, low risk, or moderate risk. In the event that you identify the high risk, then concentration should be more there, but doesn't mean that you disregard the low risk. For the low risk, you adopt a simplified due diligence measure where you just get reasonable information. For the high risk, the law requires that you get enhanced due diligence information You'll get additional information about the customer, any verifications that need to be done, maybe from NIRA, from immigration office. You have to go further to that step, getting national IDs, getting passport details, documentation. That is what we mean by going an extra mile, enhanced due diligence. So that is, in brief, what we mean by adopting a risk-focused due diligence measures. So review whether your customers or beneficial owners are sanctioned. We have discussed that these criminals hide behind companies, so there's need to lift the veil to find out who is behind the company, who is hiding behind a complex structure, and you screen those individuals because they're hiding for a purpose, because they know they have something to hide. That's why they create the complex structures. So you need to review who are the beneficial owners and subject them to sanction screening. Scrutinize the transactions. This takes us back to where we said transaction monitoring is key. And once you identify a positive match, you need to report the suspicious transactions. For example, what amounts to suspicious, and any of your clients deals in trading sensitive goods or goods covered by the United Nations Security Council. Those designations of entities or individuals, any transactions or trade or import or exports involving such individuals. So it might, it's an indication of a suspicious transaction where such listed individuals are involved. So among other compliance obligations are the reporting obligations, where it's mandatory that you have to report the person. Once you have identified that you have a listed person as a client, then you must report to FIA subject to regulation 12.8 of the anti-terrorism regulations. So it's important. That's why we started with you understanding what do we mean by sanction. Try to do a match, whether automated or manual, to see if this, when the UN, the United Nations Security Council issues these lists subject to the resolutions that have been passed by the respective sanction committees, you try to do a match to see if you have anyone associated, whether directly, indirectly, whether wholly involved or in part or in full with these individuals. Once you identify a positive match, now these are reporting obligations that we are talking about, that you are supposed to report to FIA. So amidst all these recommendations, all these obligations, for us to achieve an effective implementation of targeted financial sanctions, we need to demonstrate to the International Cooperation Review Group that we are implementing all these that we have been speaking of. In brief, we need to demonstrate, we are required to demonstrate statistics on the funds that have been frozen, properties that have been seized. So it's not just speaking of these things, but the implementation, the practicability of them, putting them in place, having in place a robust system to combat preferential financing is very key, because once they come on ground here, they do verifications to see if you have these policies that we are speaking of, to see if you sanction screen the clients that you have, to see if you monitor transactions of your clients, to see also if you're risk averse or aware of the preferential countries or of the UN sanction lists as and when they have been disseminated, and to see if you keep track of what FIA disseminates regarding to the amendments to the list, and you accordingly take the necessary steps to do a match. If you identify a match, you freeze. When you freeze, you inform FIA. Once we do that, we are in position, then we shall be good to go to get off this gray list. And this requires cooperation between all agencies, that is FIA, the ministries, Ministry of Internal Affairs communicates to us regarding also the designations, and also as we communicate to you. So the entities you communicate to us, basing on what you have identified on grounds, if you have the matches, where the properties, are they in the NGOs? Are they in the real estate business? Are they in the casinos? Are the criminals they are playing, using the funds to play? So it is a combined effort, and it calls for cooperation within us internally. And this global fight against preferential financing, it's an international global fight that calls for all countries to cooperate. But most importantly, let's focus on us here, demonstrating this to the International Cooperation Review Group so that we get off the gray list. Thank you for your audience. At this point, I can take on all the questions regarding the obligations for you to implement these targeted financial sanctions, regarding how you need to implement these obligations, regarding what are targeted financial sanctions, regarding the role of FIA to disseminate these amendments as per the United Nations sanction list or designations. So we can take on the floor for questions. If anyone has a question, they can be typed in the chat as I respond to one by one. Thank you. Okay, in the chat, I see a question whether we have risk assessment templates we share with you for your own assessment. We do not have risk assessment templates, but normally it is the responsibility of the respective supervisory authorities to do that, because also in the FATF recommendations under 20, we are supposed to demonstrate effective supervision of the financial institutions and designated non-financial businesses and professions. So your respective supervisory authorities now, this is where they come in for every sector that is regulated. Ministry of Energy, Dealers and Precious Stones and Metals, they are accountable persons. This is their responsibility. And they have to demonstrate supervision by issuing guidelines, guidance notes, conducting inspections. So once they do this, we are also in position, because that's one area that we are also lagging behind, demonstrating effective supervision. So once they do that, to provide you with a risk assessment template, we shall be able to score on this to get off the gray list. So for sectors that are not regulated, like the real estate sector, that is where we come in as FIA to take on the supervisory role. So for the risk asset sector, we are yet to develop one for your guidance. The NPOs, the Ministry of Energy, the casinos, it's the responsibility of the supervisory authorities. But we as FIA also, we have a role of providing guidance to accountable persons. Once you contact us on a one-on-one to provide guidance on how to do it, we are happy to provide guidance. I'll leave an email, the email that you can send the requests to have a direct engagement with the FIA is compliance@fia.go.ug. Compliance is COMPLIANCE@fia.go.ug, all lower caps. So you can send through a request there if you need guidance on anything, how to develop a template, how to do a risk assessment, how to come up with a policy, know your customer policy. We are happy to provide feedback and guidance. So shall we have the next presentation? Yes, we shall share the material. Are the labor recruitment externalization companies also on the list of highly volatile businesses where money laundering and terrorism financing activities are subject to bright? You are actively involved in the national risk assessment. I think you can guide on the labor recruitment companies. If you're here in the chat, do we have a responsibility to report on high value transactions as well, in addition to suspicious ones? Yes, you do have a responsibility to report on high value transactions in regards to suspicion. If we have mentioned their transactions to a high risk jurisdictions, that to countries that are dealing in preferential financing, yes, you do have. I'm trying to go through the chat for the upcoming questions. Keep the questions coming as I scroll through to answer the previous questions. Yes, I see many comments about sharing, requests to share the presentation. We are going to share the presentation, but I made a request for members to rename and log in using their name and entity other than providing the entity in the chat. It becomes easy to extract the attendance once you rename than the chat. The chat is a bit hectic to go through each and every chat to write down the name. So if you can click on the 3 dots near your name and just choose the option of rename, you kindly put for me your name and the organization, maybe the sector, NGO. If real estate, you include real estate. If casino, you include casino. Because this participation is key for us to demonstrate to the International Cooperation Review Group that the training was carried on and there was participation from the different sectors that were meant to be the target audience for this training. Any other question?
Okay, Fiona, there are some questions in the Q&A.
Okay, we shall take about a minute or two to wait for some questions before we get the closing remarks.
Hello, Fiona. There are some questions in the Q&A.
Yes, in the annual reporting template, we have so far customized one for the NPO sectors. We got complaints that it was so huge and there were areas that were not applicable to you, that were applicable to financial institutions. So yes, when you go to our website about reporting, you'll download one that is tailored to, that is specific to NGOs. Yes, maybe if I'll leave, I don't know, I'll share the slides through the supervisory authorities so they can share to you, because I don't seem to have the emails of each and every one of you here. So the slides will be shared through your supervisors. Okay. So, Mr. Baraza Lawrence, is the available legal regime adequate enough? If not, what's the option be done? Mr. Baraza is from FIA and from the legal department. I think he's most suitable to answer this question, but it's work in progress. We normally respond to the identified deficiencies. And as of now, the identified deficiencies as per the International Cooperation Review Group, or FATF, were the gaps in regards to that our legal framework did not provide for implementation of targeted financial sanctions. Previously, it was the issue to do with the definition of terrorism financing and profession financing as per the United Nations Convention on Suppression of Terrorism. We had to adopt that extensive definition from the United Nations Convention on Suppression of Terrorism and Disruption of Proliferation of Weapons of Mass Destruction. So, which we addressed in the amendments, and we have currently addressed the deficiency in regards to the targeted financial sanctions, which explains the enactment of the Anti-Terrorism Amendment Act. So far, so good in regards to addressing the deficiencies in the legal framework. Now, I think the ball is in our court to implement the targeted financial sanctions and to sensitize the accountable persons. What's on ground now is the need to sensitize the accountable persons on the implementation of targeted financial sanctions, which explains the training today. So any labor recruitment, I don't know whether Bright is online about the labor recruitment, because what the National Risk Assessment does, it assesses the threat that we are exposed to as a country, the money laundering and terrorism financing threat, both externally and domestically, in terms of the crimes that we are exposed to. Domestically could be crimes like corruption, tax evasion, fraud. So I'm trying to establish whether in the crimes there's the labor recruitment, anything attached to the labor recruitment as a threat. Because I would attach this to human trafficking, which is also a threat that is included in the National Risk Assessment. Also amongst other crimes, offenses that we are exposed to, like drug trafficking. So in the perspective of human trafficking, labor recruitment is human trafficking. It's a predicate offense for money laundering, or there's what we call the predicate offenses, offenses that culminate into money laundering, like fraud, corruption, human trafficking, drug trafficking. So if I'm to view labor recruitment, externalization companies, moving people here and there, I think I see an element of human trafficking here, and which is a predicate offense for money laundering. Is there a minimum or maximum transaction amount for reporting? Yes, the reporting thresholds, 20 million and above, an equivalent of 20 million and above is supposed to be reported to FIA by all reporting entities. That's the threshold for reporting large cash transactions. So you go to our website, there's the GoML, you can report through GoML system for large cash, or through use of the emails lctr@fia.go.ug. So does the death penalty apply worldwide? There are some countries that no longer have such death penalties. Yes, it's true. It's true, there are some countries that don't have the death penalties, but in our legal system, I'm yet to find out. There was a case that I think overturned the death penalty. I'm yet to get a clear stand on that. The Achiguli case, I'm yet to get a clear stand on the death penalty in Uganda. if Brenda is online to advise on the stand of the death penalty in Uganda, whether it's applicable. Brenda, are you online? Our manager, legal. Okay, how long does it take for one organization to register with and get a certificate? I see Ivan is responding to the question. I'm yet to find out if Konyi was sanctioned. Someone is asking for a company or individual that has been sanctioned in Uganda. Hello, Fiona. I just wanted to respond to that issue of the death penalty. The death penalty in Uganda is still being provided for in the laws that are being passed. For instance, if you note that a provision for the death penalty was made in this recent anti-homosexuality bill. But what it is generally, the international community feels that it's a violation of human rights. So what usually happens is that whereas the death penalty is imposed, what it really translates to is a life sentence. Uganda does not really action the death penalty. You find that that person who is called the executor or the hangman, the dates are not set for the execution. So at the end of the day, it ends up translating into a life sentence. I hope that helps a bit. All right, Ivan is still typing, and regarding to how long it takes to register or get a certificate with FIA, I shall get an answer for that. But as he leaves the answer in the chat, it takes 2 weeks to get a certificate with FIA from the time of submission of the registration documents. So once you have submitted the documents and the compliance and inspection department verifies that you have submitted everything, or through the successful submission online using the GoML system and the verifications have been done, 2 weeks from the time of the submission, or even less. Transactions between the different organization accounts supposed to be reported if above 20 million. These are not payments, but transfers. I think that the law provides the transactions from an accountable person to one accountable person that has been regulated by a supervisory authority. They're both regulated, do not necessitate reporting to be reported. So if it's an organization that's an accountable person to another organization that is an accountable person, they are not worth reporting. As per the Anti-Money Laundering Act, I'm yet to get the section. Okay, how do we access the reporting form for transactions above 20 million? Ivan. The reporting forms are on the website. You go to reporting, the forms are there. But we have the ongoing onboarding process for different accountable persons for the GoML to report through the GoML system. So different accountable persons have been onboarded, and it's done in phases. For those that have been onboarded, they use the GoML system. For those that are not yet onboarded, they use the link that has been provided by Ivan in the chat. Are we required to report on payments, only payments above 20 million to suppliers? For the NGOs currently, the large cash is reported since they hold transactions with the banks. The bank reports every large cash transaction equivalent to 20 million and above to FIA made on your accounts. So there's no need for the NGOs to file, that will be double reporting. The bank already captures that information. Because I believe you have bank accounts that you operate, and that information is captured through the bank, since the bank files the large cash on a weekly basis. Okay. Annual compliance report. Annual compliance report is regulation what? It's regulation what? Yeah? For failure to submit the annual compliance report, it's a fine not exceeding 9,000 currency points and 500 currency points for each day that you continue to not to file. And the currency point is equivalent to 20,000 Uganda shillings. So 9,000 currency points for failure to file an annual compliance report. And for each day that you fail to submit it, an additional 500 currency points. Each currency point is equivalent to 20,000 Uganda shillings. So you can multiply the 9,000 times the 20,000. And for each continued day of the offense, 500 times the 20,000. Is it possible to get guidance on how to develop an anti-money laundering terrorism financing policies to match the NGO fund? Yes, it's possible to get the guidance on how to develop the policies. We have shared an email where you can send through your request for guidance, compliance@fia.go.ug. The team will be happy to support because it's one of our duties to provide guidance to accountable persons. Thank you. This video wants an example of that an NGO is required to report. We mentioned that the NGOs, their transactions are captured by the bank. But in your dealings as NPOs, what you need to look out for is transactions to suppliers, because in this customer due diligence obligation that we have mentioned, extends to the beneficiaries that you deal with who are benefiting from your service. The suppliers that you deal with, do you sanction screen them to see if they're dealing in country, they are coming from countries that are attached to preferential financing? Do you sanction screen the beneficiaries? And do you sanction screen the donors? So in regards to the transactions, any transactions to the suppliers equivalent to 20 million, you need to be mindful of that when you're monitoring transactions to suppliers. But when it comes to the reporting obligations, these transactions can be captured by the bank. The withdrawals from the direct transfers from your account to the supplier's accounts, unless if there is cash involved, because now what we were saying about the risk assessment for the from the word go, the risk assessment that you will do, you'll have to, it has 4 parameters. You're going to assess the customers, nature of customers that you have, including their behavior or where they're coming from, their origin and jurisdictions, as well as behavior. You will assess the service that you have as NGOs. Are you dealing in high-risk projects? For example, humanitarian projects like provision of food, or projects that are attached to allocation, is it settlement of refugees? Those are high-risk projects. So you're going to also assess that your geographical nature as NPOs. Are you operating in high-risk jurisdictions? Are you operating in branches? Are you operating at the border? Are you scattered? So if so, you're then high risk. If you're not, then you're low risk. If you have clients that originate from high-risk jurisdictions, from jurisdictions that are known for terrorism financing or preferential financing, if you have donors, because the NPOs, the donors are your clients. If you have donors that originate from the sanctioned countries or high-risk countries, then that means your customer risk profile is high. The product or nature of service we have discussed, you have to assess the risk attached to the projects that you deal with like the refugee settlement projects, those are high-risk projects, the humanitarian projects, provision of food, because that support can be used for the terrorists, providing food to that, there can be diversion of the service to fund terrorism. And terrorism financing does not only mean financial support, also logistical support, food, shelter, airtime, all that is financing terrorism. So you find that in the risk assessment, you're assessing the customers, the service that you have, and the geographical location. So in regards to reporting, if there's an element of cash, now that's where in the service, if you have cash payments that you make to the suppliers, you're high risk. because that money has no audit trail. It cannot be captured in the system. Any cash-based economy exposes us to a high risk for money laundering or terrorism financing. So any money that is paid to a supplier from your account to the supplier, it's captured by the banks and reported to FIA. Unless if you've made any payments on cash that you feel you need to report to FIA that were not captured by the bank. How much is the fine for late submission of the report? I answered the late submission of the report. The fine. Are we required to report? Okay, finished. What is the fine for late submission of an error? All right. Thank you all. It appears that marks the end of the training. I've addressed all the questions, unless there's any that is coming up. What about mobile money payments? Are they also captured? Mobile money payments, the mobile money service providers are also accountable persons. Those dealing in money transfer service, the money transfer service providers are also accountable persons. They are supposed to report large cash. So once you make any transaction as an NGO through mobile money, the mobile money service providers can report that, but they're also worth reporting. Yes, all right. Thanks a lot for your time. Thanks for making up time to attend in big numbers. We really appreciate. A big thanks to all the coordinators from the respective supervisory authorities that have made this happen. We really appreciate you. Thank you for making this happen. And the Financial Intelligence Authority is pleased for the good work that you have done. We wouldn't have been able to make it without your indulgence in this coordination. Thank you all for your time. We appreciate. The slides will be shared. And I think at this time, you're free to leave as and when you want to. I'll stay online because I'm getting messages in the chat, but thank you so much for attending.